Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Rob Turley, your host at Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. Oh, my Google's trying to talk to me over there. Don't do that. Now, today I have a guest with me, Noelle Williams. But before we get to that, I want to thank our sponsor, White Rabbit Intel, where you're able to hyper target the market and know who will buy from you before you speak to them. So think of it as extremely strategic account mapping. Now back to it. Noelle Williams, she's an incredible person that I had such a pleasure of an experience to meet her because she does something that's truly unique. It's different in a way where most management consultants have a cookie cutter process approach and they just try to implement something and it doesn't work a lot of the time, and or it somewhat works, which is not all that great. Where a company is like a living, breathing thing. Every single one is different. Where sure, they have all the same divisions. They're doing it for the same reason, to make money so that you can pay your people, so they can go home, they can take care of their families, and all you're doing is trying to solve a problem, working toward the same mission, vision, purpose, whatever. But all the things that are happening, those intricacies are different. And so she deals in change management, and also she's a productivity consultant in a lot of ways. So how to make a company more productive and focusing on culture and people to make that happen along with processes. So it's a multidimensional approach that is fit to the business itself, as it should be, since it truly is an organic thing and a totally unique thing. Now, Noelle, how did I do?
Nicely put, Rob. Very much appreciate that.
For sure. So yeah, tell me a little bit about how you got into that position. What happened to make you get into something so highly specific that most people don't even know exists?
My career started in the corporate world. My dad actually worked for Procter & Gamble for 42 years, and being a Midwesterner, Cincinnati native to be specific, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to go down that route. I discovered pretty quickly that I was not really built that way, to be, part of a much larger machine. So after spending about 4 years at Procter & Gamble, I spent some time with a small management consulting firm. That's where I really started to notice there was this pattern of, we've got a set solution, and that solution came from maybe a lot of academic research, maybe a lot of industry performance metrics, but I got dissatisfied pretty quickly that every solution in every organization is not necessarily one and the same.
Yeah, and it has a lot to do with the behavioral traits, because the behaviors are the things that drive those KPIs and those metrics. So the metrics are actually meaningless without the driver for them. And I like how you say with Procter and Gamble, companies like that back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, like that, it was militaristic. The way
Very
that
much.
they have their hierarchies and everything, only report up, report up, report up. There's no top-down approach. It's
Yeah.
very impersonal. It's very structured, and you're just a cog in a machine that has one purpose. And if you go out of line, then you're out of there. So it does not appeal to people the way that human beings are, the way that they feel. And often with companies that still run it that way, their employee sentiment is low. Morale is at a baseline minimum, and the turnover rate is absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, this is not the time to ignore things that are often hard to measure, which is what our organization specializes in.
What would be hard to measure?
So an example of that would be, let's take the classic org chart for a nice illustration. Most organizations have an org chart, and it is.
And for those of you who don't know, which I really hope everybody listening does, because I'm pretty sure I know my listener base quite well, but it looks like a tree diagram with people in it.
Yeah, pretty much like that. And for many organizations, this intentional roadmap demonstrates who reports to whom, where the decision makers sit in the organization, what the functional areas are, how they relate to each other. And you can imagine that in real life, in some organizations, the way they operate day to day is a really good match for that roadmap. And for many organizations, it's not a match at all. So what's hard to measure is, how closely are we actually operating as an organization to our intention? Now, the org chart's one example, but almost anything that you can find that's written down or codified in some way is going to be a statement of intention of an organization. The thing that's hard to measure is how closely are they actually operating to that intention. That's what we measure. Why is that important? It's because as we've been doing this work for 30 years, we find a common pattern. And that pattern is that many organizations underutilize their performance capacity.
Right. Or they're deploying their people, the resources in places that they shouldn't be in the first place.
Yeah.
Or they're keeping people from spreading out cross-divisionally or cross-divisional communication, or they're keeping them from trying different new things if they want to move horizontally or if they want to move diagonally throughout the company. They're kept in a box. And when people are kept in boxes, they're not very happy.
Very, very true.
So what would you add to the whole box thing and this hierarchical structure? So an org chart is a hierarchical structure of reporting, and it creates methods of how you should keep people accountable for one another and for getting the job done. When it doesn't match up like what you're saying, what is usually the ramification of such thing?
The ramification is typically not seen until much later in the organization's processes. So this is a good pivot point, Rob, for me to talk a little bit about our general philosophy in my organization. It is first, do no harm. A lot of our competition in the management consulting space will come into an organization. They will do what I like to call the 1,000-pound gorilla move, which is we're going to bring a team of people into your organization. We're going to eat up a lot of your time, basically commandeer a conference room for 6 months, and then we're going to present you with a report. Typically, that report concludes that you've got these gaps, these problems, these issues, and we can solve them if you want to pay us one more time or 3 more times or 10 more times to implement the solution, our solution, not their solution. So the problem with boxes in organizations is very similar to the problem with boxes in management consulting, right? It doesn't take into account, as you so clearly said, an organization is an organism. And we tend to treat the entity, this organization, this team, as if it were mechanical and not organic. So taking anything that is set in motion in an organization in any aspect, whether you're making a process change, you're implementing a new ERP, you're restructuring your organization, anytime you make a move like that, you're going to directly or indirectly change the results in the rest of the organization. It's going to resonate, right? It's going to reverberate on whatever new channel you've put in place. And if you can't tell before you make those changes what kind of reverberation you're going to get, that's when you start losing traction. So underutilizing your performance capacity and putting things in boxes, typically you don't see it until after the fact. And so if you feel in your gut at any point as though you're underutilizing your performance capacity, chances are really good you are. The time to take action on that and measure it is now.
So could you convert your reverberation theory and your performance capacity into simpler English for people who are an expert in your space?
Of course. Yeah. How about I do that by way of an example?
That'd be great.
Okay. So many years ago, we got a call from a local organization who had, let's say, tried some less than effective methods for solving some of their organizational problems. By the time they got to us, it had boiled down to this. They said, can you fix our project management department? To be completely transparent, Rob, this was relatively early in my company's history. We didn't have a whole lot to speak to our client pipeline. So I said yes. And in retrospect, that was the right answer, but here's how the story played out. When we got into that organization and started looking at their project management process, we were immediately struck by the fact that the process was actually really, really good.
Yeah,
In
it's
fact,
probably agile.
right before you and I started this podcast, we were talking about process. The process was really close to world class. So that's a bit of a head scratcher when they come to us and say, will you fix our project management?
Was it the connection? Nobody, so they probably lived in a bubble and then it never left the bubble. That was probably why they thought it was broken.
Well, certainly that was part of it. The other part of it is it's just project management is where the problems were showing up, right? So the customers that were getting the service and product from that organization touched project management 1,000 times during the business cycle, right? And so that's where all the energy was focused. That's where all the
It's only the switching station, you know?
Exactly, right. And it should be. So we, after a day or two of assessing sort of what was going on, we went to the leadership of this organization and said, tell you what, we have this thing that we call a well check. And a well check is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. We're not assuming any dysfunction. We're not going to say one way or the other that things are working, they're not working. We're just going to take the pulse of your organization. That's going to involve us looking at your structure, looking at your process, looking at your people, and looking at your culture. What do you say? They said yes. And here's what we found out. We found out that the reason that project management was a quote unquote problem is because the upper management in the organization in the sales function was not following project management process.
Yep, it was the bubble issue. They weren't communicating.
So, and what made it worse was that project managers who are typically on the professional level and maybe not so high in the hierarchy, the higher the sales managers and executives got in the organization, the less equipped they felt to hold them accountable. So they weren't about to say to a senior VP in sales, well, we're not going to take this next step and order these materials until you've done the whole feasibility study and your client signs off on it, right? Instead, the senior VP in sales said, oh, don't worry, we'll get that to you. Just make an exception.
Oh, so fear.
And so the project management process was not actually being followed, and that's what was leading to their results.
So the issue was in the sales team were afraid to approach their boss.
It was a multifunctional cultural issue where the leaders in the organization were not following protocol. And
so they got happy and lazy.
When that happened, it showed up in the project management function. And so they kept trying to go back to that function and quote unquote fix it. Here's the worst part of this story, and it is relevant to something you just mentioned. The professionals in project management were tired of getting blamed, and they were all flight risk, which meant if that talent, that expertise walked out the door, that organization would be in a serious situation trying to replace them, right?
Sure.
So we did these well check metric activities, which we call QPC diagnostics, quality performance capacity, got the results, got in the conference room with these leaders and basically said to them in a very tactful way, you are the problem. The problem is not your process. The problem is your cultural norms don't support the process and its application. And we never got invited back again, which you can imagine, was a bit of a blow from a business perspective.
Yeah,
but it was a big check mark in our to-dos, which is to say, you know what, we're going to tell the truth. And we are not going to collaborate with an organization that is intentionally avoiding that truth.
Well,
Hence,
I mean, just as someone who does what you do as well, if they're trying to avoid the truth, if they don't break that paradigm, you have no job with
yeah,
them.
yeah,
There's no work to do.
right, right. So, even after 30 years, it's what we tend to see is there are general patterns around organizations. Those patterns look like misalignment. In the example I just gave you, the process and the culture were misaligned. They were not moving in the same direction. There's activity happening in all these areas in the company, but they're moving in cross purposes versus in a singular fashion toward the vision, mission, goals, and strategy of the organization. So, what we measure is the stuff that's hidden that only shows up once you see the result. By the time you see the result, it's symptomatic and it's often too late.
Right. Because those operational issues, they just it's lightweight at first and then it keeps compounding over time. It's like, it's like a frog boiling in water, right?
Yeah,
If you
it's
put
very
it
much
in
like
boiling water, it's going to jump out. If you slowly heat up the pot, it will just sit there and then eventually die.
yeah, yeah. So, a lot of what we have encountered in our organization with our client work is a process and a phenomenon we've come to call Simplexity. And if you're a fan of words, I can break that down for you a little bit more. Simplexity is when you take something that is inherently complex and you try to overlay a simple solution on it. Let me give you an example. We've got 50% turnover, right? Which a lot of organizations, unfortunately, are facing right now. And the answer to that phenomenon is let's do an employee engagement survey. Because an employee engagement survey will tell us not only what the problem is, what specifically is making them leave, but give us the answer for how to fix it. The problem with that is, a survey is one moment in time. And that one moment in time, when people complete a survey, guess what's happening? They're either remembering what just occurred or they remember what was most impactful to them, neither of which is necessarily valid and viable data sets when you're looking at employee engagement. So if you
Or they lie because they're afraid that it's not anonymous.
Right, exactly. So think about all the resources that are being used, all the money that is being spent, and all the time that's being wasted. Never mind time, but energy that's being wasted in organizations where they're taking something very complex like employee engagement and taking a simple approach to it, like let's do an employee engagement survey. That is to us an example of asking and answering the wrong business question. The cool thing about Simplexity is it can also be understood in reverse. If you look at something really complex like lack of employee engagement and or employee turnover, and you look at the hidden drivers that create that problem that you're seeing, often the patterns are very simple. They are things like roles and responsibilities are unclear. And so nobody knows who's doing what. And there are role overlaps and there's conflict because other people are messing in my territory, right? So there's a lot of things in the other parts of the system, like the structure and the process, that are broken that show up in the people.
Oh,
We,
to add to the Simplexity thing too, even
yeah,
simpler, you're putting a BandAid on a stab wound.
well, yeah, I could have said it that way too. Very good. Exactly. Yeah. There's there are some scenarios I could share with you that sound like that, look like that, and feel like that. And I bet you some of your listeners, as they're considering this concept, are getting this feeling in their gut. Uh-oh. I think we might have an issue, and we're not going to see it until 3 months from now when it's too late. There's a lot of reliance on KPIs these days, which unfortunately the vast majority of them are trailing indicators.
Yeah, and then there's OKRs. That's more.
OKRs.
No, there's KPIs, and then there's OKRs, right? So OKRs are the future KPIs. KPIs are the present.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of an analogy stretch, but it reminds me a bit of the difference between accounting and finance, right? So accounting is looking at the history and making sure that all the books match up, right? And that everything is reconciled. Finance is the art of predicting what your future is going to look like and making effective plans based on those predictions. And so we're much more like the finance arm than we are the accounting.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, accounting is just number crunchers. Finance are the people who do the real stuff.
It's the artistry behind it. And not all of it can be proven. Not all of it can be fully data driven. And unfortunately, we often live in a business reality that forces us into that box that says, well, what did the data say? And we follow what the data say. That may not be the whole story.
Right. It's a mix between behavioral and data.
Yeah.
What I do is we do past and present data analysis, right?
Yeah.
And then we're able to accurately predict who you're going to do business with in the future, right?
Yeah.
Outside of that, it's not correct. It's just like finance in a way where you're predicting what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's doing that accurately using the data. But when you're talking about an operational process, that is not always, because the data that you're measuring isn't correct. Like, for example, a company like mine, we have control over that.
Right.
We get the data, we source it. We know how to handle it and what's going to be there, like all the different types and everything. That's different when it's all there. But if the issue operationally where the data is not always the best is because you don't have the data that you need in order to calculate that metric in order to solve that problem, because you never tracked it.
Right.
It was never tracked. It was never thought of. There's missing pieces in it. It's a bunch of variables with no constants. And it becomes an issue. Now, what is the worst that you have ever seen in your career? Have you ever walked into a company and just turned around and went, no?
No, but I will tell you a story of that's similar in the sense that how can I put this? We fired a client because we really didn't see that they were going to ultimately follow through with what they needed to do. And so
a lack of commitment.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I feel like we're in this moment in business, maybe in life too, where the real issue is we are looking for answers when in fact we should be looking for questions. I think we spend a lot of time asking and answering the wrong business questions.
I love that you say that, looking for answers, but really we should be looking for the right questions. And I am such a firm believer in that philosophy, because if you look at it, you keep asking questions, looking for more questions, and then when you run into enough questions, then you find the answer of the thing that you were looking for to begin with through the questions that you've been asking.
Yeah, it reminds me of, school, which, I was never a huge fan of because it also puts you in a box. But in any case, I'm thinking of, some of the math questions that we would get asked in algebra, right? So if train A is leaving Chicago at 9:30 in the morning and, train B is leaving Milwaukee, at what time will they intersect, right? And I never understood how asking and answering that kind of question made me a better person or made me smarter or made me more equipped to deal with the world. I think we suffer from similar phenomenon in business. I think we ask and answer the wrong questions. And I think what we need to be asking is, how authentic are we? How courageous are we? How self-disciplined are we? And how progressive are we? And by progressive, I simply mean, are we looking forward versus looking over our shoulder? And I think that the questions that are most vital to our future are going to involve asking and answering those questions. And I believe that not only for business, I believe it for
life. We call it at my organization, get it, want it, can do it. Those are the three factors. And get it means you understand it, by the way, not get it as in grab it.
Yeah.
Get it, want it, you want to be able to do it, or you want to do it. And then the can do it. That means you have the ability, the competency, and the skill to be able to do so.
Right. Yeah. So back to your question, worst we've ever seen. I'm going to pull the reins back just a little bit on that and say the one client that, although it was lucrative, we had to fire because their commitment was, we want to empower all of our managers at all levels. So we spent some time early on in that trajectory, helping them develop the entire system that would create that.
Oh, you know what? And just tell me if I'm right or
Yeah.
wrong here.
Yes.
When you're saying empower all the managers, number one, if you try to make everybody happy, make no one happy. There's
No,
that.
that's very true.
Number two would be, okay, so they're putting in the structure that maybe do some like payout bonuses or some sort of like something that could be operationalized, right? Then number three, the problem that I think that you might have run into here is that they didn't understand their people enough, or their people were the problem, so that you would have instructed them, you need to fire all these people because they will never be happy here. They don't have the drivers. They don't have anything that you need in order to be able to drive this as an effective thing.
Wow, you know, you have covered about 3 or 4 different stories in that short synopsis. This particular one, actually, the talent was quite good. The problem with the organization was, as we helped them develop this trajectory, this multifaceted plan and roadmap for how to empower managers, they stopped at step 1, and step 1 was provide education, custom designed education. And that was step 1. Step 2, 3, 4, and 5 had to do with things like structure, right? Creating the sorts of bonuses, creating the roles and responsibilities templates, you know, all the things, process and structure that are going to help implement what they're learning, right? Smooth that path. They refused to go past the education piece. And here's what happened. 600 managers went through the education. And every single one of them said some version of the following. We were so thrilled by everything we learned and all the new tools we had, and we could not wait to implement them. We went back to the organization and discovered, to our horror, nothing had changed. And so we couldn't implement any of what we learned. And here's what they said. It's as if going to that educational opportunity, amassing this knowledge, gaining this energy and excitement was like creating a plug. It was a 3-prong plug. And we went back to work and all the outlets were 2-prong. We had nowhere to plug in because the structure, the process, and the culture weren't keeping pace with what's happening with the people. And we see that misalignment all the time. In this particular case, it was unwillingness to do anything other than check the box. Oh, we trained our people.
Yeah, they're just trying to do it because their investor told them to.
We trained our people. Yeah.
And
So
it's funny you say that too, where I call it status quo-itis,
yeah,
or the
exactly.
do nothing disease. And yes, it is terminal, but there's a cure, and the cure is to stop doing the exact same thing you're doing all the time and make a change.
You know, the thing is that we like predictability. You know, we like the comfort zone of, well, we know what's going to happen if we do A, B, and C.
It's an incredible thing too, because we're fighting the laws of nature. Chaotic, loose and chaotic is nature, and we are fighting it. And that's what gives us comfort, is fighting the nature of everything.
Right, right. Which that creates all kinds of ripples that will, you know, we could maybe not completely avoid them, but we could certainly minimize those ripples if we could just lean into the fact that life is not predictable and organizations are not mechanical and people are not programmable. And if we could adapt to,
I would argue that people are self-programmable.
say more.
You cannot program someone, but
Ah,
you are self-programmable. It is a choice to reprogram your brain.
interesting. Yeah,
Because
exactly.
your brain's like an operating system. You can update it. You can get viruses where if you get like depression, some sort of issue in your life, anxiety, and you can have different issues, glitches, all that stuff. Like let's say if you just burst out crying out of nowhere and you don't know what happened, you just experienced a glitch. It's fine. But you can rewire it. You can do that, and you can recode your system to think certain ways by making choices. But all it is that it's coming in tune with your conscious and your subconscious and making a group decision between the two.
That description sounds a lot like alignment. It's another word we like to use a lot in our organization is coherence. Everything hangs together.
Yeah.
If you've ever been to, you've watched a movie where like 2 or 3 of the scenes, you're thinking, why did they put that in there? That doesn't add to the story. That doesn't make any sense. And in your gut, something didn't quite hang together. It's like that in organizations too. Typically, we know when something is not coherent. And by the way, coherence does not mean that everything is going great. Coherence means it all makes sense. And so often we run into leaders who act as if, in other words, our organization should be doing X, Y, and Z. And so the leaders operate as if it should be doing what it should be doing is in fact what it's doing. And normally it doesn't. So there needs to be an adoption, a reliance, and a comfort with what is, not what should be. That's hard to stomach for a lot of leaders. I understand it. The truth is not always pretty, but it often hangs together. It's often very coherent if you step back and look at the landscape and do that authentically.
Yeah, I call that founder's disease. That's a second disease stated here, is that the way that you see it and want it is the way that it needs to be done, or that you think it should be done, or you're driving toward, when really, there's 3 different examples. The way that your organization is running. You want it to be run a certain way? Well, guess what? The people tell you otherwise. It will
Yeah,
not be done that way, and if you try to force it, you're going to get a high turnover.
right.
Another one, your product. If you want your product to be a certain way and be built for a certain thing, and you want to talk about it the way that you understand it, no one on God's green earth is going to buy your damn product. It's
Mhm.
not how it works. The market determines your offering, period.
Yeah.
And then the third case would be that based on whatever it is that your company is doing, that you want X type of a result, but it produces Y type of a result. You cannot alter it unless you change the entire process, product, or whatever it may be to get to that result. You
Yeah.
cannot drive a result by deciding this is the result I want if it doesn't actually follow the structure and if it doesn't follow the pathways that are within that company. It doesn't work. So,
Now since you've brought up diseases twice, I think, now might be a good time to comment a little bit on the COVID situation and sort of what the impact has been on organizations, at least as it relates to this conversation. Because it seems to me that when COVID hit and we were completely unprepared for it, what we started to see in organizations were not necessarily new problems. There were some new problems, but
there were the existing problems that flared up.
exactly, they became more visible.
When you put stress on the system, you start seeing all the problems.
They became more urgent, they became more imminent. And so some of the vulnerabilities that we measure with our QPC diagnostics, you can see those things ahead of time. I don't mean you can predict the future, but you can look at your organizational entity, your organism, and see where your strengths, vulnerabilities, and progressive areas are, and start paying attention to those metrics instead of the ones that happen after it's too late. And many of the problems that are faced in organizations today that are really brought to the surface through a crisis like COVID, they already existed, but they were managing without dealing with them. We are in a state now where we can't afford to not look at these vulnerabilities and really
In the end, it'll make us stronger. And to give someone like people a visual of that, it's like, think about it this way. You could drive a car that has a bad transmission. You might not even know it has a bad transmission. You just have the engine light on. But the second, you get into a position where you decide to put the pedal to the metal, floor it, have it at 7,000 RPM, transmission blows within like a minute and a half.
Mhm.
Car's shot, cannot drive the car anymore. But you've been driving the car for the past year and you had the engine light on. Who cares? It doesn't matter. As soon as you
Right.
got in that position where you had to speed up like that, your car
Yeah.
just blows up and it's dead.
I think some of the leadership mythology that's been adopted over the course of many, many
But did you
years.
say mythology?
Mythology.
Oh, really?
I think is that leaders need to know everything, right? They need to have the answers. And I think that's a myth. I think the reality is that leaders need to know how to ask and answer the right questions with the right people. And if they're not willing to be vulnerable, if they're not willing to be open, if they're not willing to be transparent, then the scenario you just described, where suddenly one day the car doesn't go anywhere anymore, that's what they face.
Yeah, or the leader themselves snaps under all the pressure because
Yeah,
that is a hell of a beast of burden, thinking that you need to have all the answers, how
yeah,
much stress that puts on you.
yeah.
I mean, it's the weight of 1,000 worlds, and you have to just act calm, cool, and collected. So what you're doing is that you're trying to compartmentalize it and just hold it in.
Mhm.
You're not going to last that long.
It's funny because the great resignation is showing up in executive ranks as well. So you start looking at some of the what you would have considered to be more permanent roles in organizations. There are people at the C level who are saying, why am I doing what I'm doing? And many of
Yeah, they
them,
leave and literally nothing changes.
yeah, they're feeling very much a part of this. Hey, I need to step back and look at my life and seriously assess, what is this about? What is the legacy that I'm leaving? Right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Now we're going to move to the last segment of
Yes.
the conversation. So
Hmm.
I would like to know if everybody were to forget every single thing that we just talked about today. And I know there was a whole lot too. It was pretty
Yeah.
in depth. One of the more technical conversations that I've had on the podcast. So, if there were one thing for people to take away from you, to walk away and remember, remind themselves of, and take action on today, what would it be?
Mm. Trust your gut. If you
Really?
are a leader and you have a gut feeling that your organization is underutilizing its performance capacity, chances are really good that it is. And the time to take action is now. Best way to start understanding those hidden drivers is to adopt a stance as a leader that is authentic, that is progressive, meaning break the status quo, that is courageous and self disciplined. Go find some help, some support that can help you validate what your gut is telling you, and find the roadmap out of that space, because it is possible.
When you first said gut, it worried me because gut decisions are really awful sometimes. But if it's the gut feeling, like you're saying,
Yeah.
that something's wrong, I can almost guarantee that there is something wrong.
Yeah.
Or if something is falling apart, or if
Mhm.
you're not utilizing your resources right, or if you're overspending, or any of these things, if you have a gut feeling for that, it's probably true. And finding help is great too. Validating it is also great with data
Yes.
from the people who can help you, whether it's organizationally, like yourself, or if it's with your revenue operations, like
Mhm.
someone with me, right?
Mhm.
It's to give
Absolutely.
yourself that validation to make sure, take that temperature check, not even temperature check, but to pretty much plumb the system, clean it out, make sure everything's going the way that it's supposed to be going. Now,
Absolutely.
Noelle, what's the best place for people to contact you and where to find you?
We can be reached at www.interproperformance.com. And there's a spot there for you to contact us for a general inquiry, to ask a question, and we will love to learn more about your unique organization, your vision, and how we can help accelerate your path.
Yep, you're also on LinkedIn. Yep,
Yes, we are. Noelle Williams and Interpro Performance Solutions. Look us up.
awesome. And do you have any book recommendations? Just one.
Oh my goodness, yes. I would highly recommend a book called The Human Cloud. It is about the emerging gig economy, and I highly recommend you spend some time with that. There's also many other resources that you can glean from that book. Check it out.
Beautiful. Awesome. So I want to thank everybody today, and I want to thank the sponsor, White Rabbit Intel, where you can predictably know who is most likely to become your next best customer. So appreciate it, everybody. You can go to White Rabbit Intel at www.whiterabbitintel.com, and that's rabbit with two B's. If you share this podcast, please share it with your friends, your family, your colleagues, because if you get value from it, please share it with others. Don't just keep it to yourself. This is a not-for-profit podcast, so sharing it is great because I self-budget this entire thing. If people did not already actually know that. Now, when you share it, please use hashtag DTRH podcast or tag me or tag Noelle or any of the other guests and any of the other podcasts. They will always engage with you, and then you can help drive some of your own engagement that way. Hope everybody learned a lot, and thank you so much. Have a great morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you are in the world. If you enjoyed this episode, follow Down the Rabbit Hole podcast for new episodes weekly on Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Pandora, and YouTube. If you'd like to apply to be featured on the podcast or recommend a featured guest, please feel free to email us at theteam@whiterabbitintel.com.